Benvenuti a questo appuntamento di Endless Residency, osservatorio sulla mobilità artistica che ho il piacere di curare con Silvia Conta per il programma culturale di Via Farini. Oggi abbiamo come ospite Todd Lanier Lester, artista e produttore culturale statunitense, per cui questo incontro si terrà in lingua inglese. Ringrazio e saluto ovviamente Todd e ricordo brevemente che Endless Residency è un osservatorio che prende diverse forme. Oltre a questo public program c'è un canale Instagram, dei questionari ed è un progetto di ricerca volto a studiare la mobilità nei suoi vari aspetti da un punto di vista quantitativo, qualitativo e di ricerca culturale. This appointment with Todd Lanier Lester is titled "Can Art Residency Be Activist?" It's a pleasure for me to introduce Todd Lanier Lester, artist, writer, hi Todd, and cultural producer.
Hello.
Hello, from Tennessee. He lives between Sao Paulo and the USA. You collaborated with different institutions, both inside and outside the art world. You built innovative and cross-sector coalition-led projects, dealing with a range of different and all of them very urgent topics, ranging from the right to the city, to human rights, to the safety of artists around the world facing increasing risk, as we know, of persecution and censorship. All those projects until one of the most recent one, Love Till It Hurts, that ranges from 2018 until 2020. A project on HIV and related stigmas is one of the last. I have the pleasure.
It is the last.
Yeah, it is the last because, of course, ended last year. I had the pleasure to meet you on the occasion of Engage Public School in 2017, a public school that Via Farini organized with the patronage of the city of Milan, dealing with the topics of social exclusion. And you shared in that moment some reflections on socially engaged practices, sorry for the noise, and more specifically, your experience with Lancioneci, an artist-led cultural platform focused on the many challenges citizens are facing in contemporary cities. So, given this background, given this complex and multi-layered milieu, I would like to remind the title we decided, no? Together, Can Art Residency Be Activist? You worked intensively on at many levels of artist mobility. One of the first questions I would like to pinpoint is the many different shapes and formats of art residency now seems ubiquitous, no? Seems like we are surrounded by the concept of mobility in contemporary art, and they are shaping the art world. From your experience, how and when art residency can be a catalyst for activism? So I would like to start from the very title of this conversation. Thank you.
Okay. I'm just making notes to myself and I'd also I think in the rhizome that my work looks like. So let me start somewhere in the bubble of my notes. First, I'm going to say that I prefer, we picked the title together, but today I'll tell you that I prefer the term social justice than the abstract activist. In 1927, I believe, Walter Benjamin wrote the author as producer for a conference at the Institution Against Fascism in Paris, I believe. And what I like about the author as producer, this Benjamin text, is how it historicizes capital A activist, because it meant something quite specific in that time period. So I would argue to you that not only does residency become ubiquitous, but so does a notion of abstract activism. That is okay. But if one wants to achieve something with activism, I feel like it's often necessary to be more specific. And so I found myself using social justice and broadening from there a lot more than broadening from the broader activism. But again, semantic details. Another semantic detail is that it is the last of the projects because I do believe that the three projects that we're talking about create a series. And I do believe that I will change the way I work after the series. The series is technically over and it spans 20 years of my practice. So that is Free Dimensional was a focus on artist safety, reimagining the usage of vacant artist residency brick and mortar units all over the world in sort of a rhizomatic sea change so that we could reach a lot of residency practitioners to have them consider that the value of vacant rooms, also the value of considering modes of selection outside of the open call, which not only wouldn't catch an activist artist, but it wouldn't catch certain experience or class realities. Um, so that was a 10-year focus from about 2003 until 2013, 2012, but one that in the way that I make projects, the expiration date is a bit of it's a bit of a ploy. I knew with that one, and I know well with the one since that part of my methodology is this sort of the language of expiration or obsolescence with the idea that that's the only way to truly set free the model. And I've told you before that I'm a big fan of sort of Gramscian quotes, like the Gramsci quote we all know most is the old are dying and the dead, the old are dying and the new cannot be born. We live in this interregnum. And so what I would like to think that my projects do are produce new forms and formulas for organizations, but they also give me, and this is very important, they give me a way to step back so that at some point after the end of the time frame, I have to be able to absolve myself of some of the responsibility because otherwise I end up being, and we know that art is business. I end up being someone who manages a lot of nonprofit business things that I can barely maintain if I'm also going to create a new project. Now, after 20 years, that's 10 years on Free Dimensional for artist safety, 5 years on Lanchonecci, which of the three is a site-specific project in Sao Paulo on the right to the city. And then the last one, HIV and stigma, for 2 years. I could say on one hand, I've certainly not given up on social justice, but I can say on one hand that I am not as interested in testing and experimenting modes of collaboration and participation as I once was. I find that my next direction is probably going to be more a form of institutional critique, criticism, and in fact, probably being a professor in an art or sociology department. I'm working on my first book now, and it is indeed a book about what I understand of my methodology, what traveled from one project to the next, and then also an interview of about 20 other artists who've been working in the so-called social turn. And that's important because, I mean, like I just already know in my heart that there's not another big multi-stakeholder project coming in that way. But I should also say that the fruit of Love Till It Hurts, the HIV project, is yet to come. So after the time marker, usually you have these explosions of activity. Free Dimensional, I believe it did convince artist residency practitioners in many parts of the world, it along with many other activists and people working on this front. I believe it did convince a sea change and that people are more open, and that also has to do with the political economy. The German state has created the Martin Roth Initiative, which is, the largest to date support for artists in danger. There's other mechanisms like the Artist Protection Fund, the Artist at Risk Connection, the Hildesheim Arts Rights Justice Academy. And most specifically, the one that I still have hands-on is a 6-apartment suite in the well-known West Beth artist community in New York City, where we actually get to apply in New York City something. When we began, we thought that maybe West Beth would give us some apartments to play with, but we didn't yet have a proof of concept. And it was interesting how 17 years later, I was approached by the apartment building, which is all artist inhabitants, to build this out. And their heart had been moved by the Syrian war. I remember specifically when we started it 5 years ago, but it also reminds me of what my heart had probably been moved by in 2003. I think a lot about how close that was to 9/11 and how a response had probably been building. The last thing I want to say before you hit me with questions is, or dialogue. We've gotten the chance to talk a few times, Giulio, which I've enjoyed. I wonder sometimes, I'm not going to try and quote your Bifo, Francisco Berardi, I believe his name is. But I do wonder sometimes when I hear him and other people theorizing about semio-capital, I do wonder sometimes if a word or a phrase like artist residency can't be eligible for that title because of the way that it's taken philanthropy and big art institution by storm. So it's not just an erosion of what it means to reside somewhere. I think the ubiquitous nature of it means that we have an erosion, because like if you were outside of the art world, would you even understand what it means to be an artist resident? Not exactly, you'd have to kind of connect something. But what I think has been well understood in the halls of capital, and that's what I mean between big institution and philanthropy, that the attachment of this now more popular phrase carries cachet. And with cachet, there's often cash. And so I've been watching it also at this level of, I mean, well, you have such disparity between a mom and pop residency on the farm, which there are many beautiful ones, and a major museum having a residency as a thing that, you know, if they have a regular funder, they add one more thing to the plate, it's going to be paid for. So you also get a big distance in the sort of political economy of who gets to host and reside. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, because this allows us to highlight a few topics, a few, of course, key topics that you touched, and I would like to start from there. You collaborated, of course, with a wide range of different institutions. And that's also why I imagine you also studied institutional critique. You are part of this discourse because you collaborated with the national cultural bodies, with like Goethe Institute, also with private funding foundations that are in a way like Musagete, brainchild of other or private organization, as well as you collaborated as board member with key network organizations like Resartis. That is also we are in dialogue with the Resartis, of course, for this research project. What I value about what you said is the fact that residencies are not just an opportunity, an added opportunity. Maybe they started like this, no? Like a chance to wander, a chance to do the flaneur, a chance to immerse yourself in a different context, a chance to dislocate our practice, both as an artist and as a curators. We have to keep in mind that residencies, like a rain, is raining everywhere, also on curators' practice, and they are shaping also curator practice. That being said, it's of course also a matter of guidelines, no, that we need to set to define what residency are, in the light of the dialogue we need to establish with the politics, because of course hosting, guesting, it's something that deals with diplomacy, and the political part of residency needs to be further investigated, both in every continent, I would add, because of course probably in Europe we are pretty used to it because we invented modern diplomacy. Now modern diploma in the modern sense was invented in Europe by French or by Vatican, I don't know, but by Europe, of course. And now we need probably to reevaluate the shape. So your point of view is specifically precious for me, because you collaborated also with advocacy groups. So with communities, no? And maybe I imagine, but I let you explain better, trying to have the politics, the political bodies understand the need of the communities, no, at a very radical level, no, not with the program of a candidate to political run, but with policy making, no, and the role of artists and curators in this is specifically powerful. And so, if you could, for instance, with your last project about HIV stigma, I imagine you managed to convey many, different voices. If you could explain a little bit more this. Thank you.
Sure. Let me just do a little note to self. It's interesting that you mentioned politics in this way, because recently my husband and I had our wedding party at the bar, which is the center of Lanchonecce. And Lanchonecce is over, but like the other projects, it has some of its biggest works upcoming. So I'll go a little deeper on Lanchonecce, but I'll loop back on Free Dimensional. Lanchonecce is a bar that is at the base of a 500 apartment modernist masterpiece. Unfortunately, the architect passed away very soon after its construction, and its legacy was not so protected. And it became, through sort of a snowball resale in the 60s, became predominantly occupied by Northeastern regional Brazilians as its inhabitants, and has a very dense inhabitancy per apartment. People say between 4,000 and 5,000 people live in these apartments. It's hard to know exactly. But on the night of our wedding party, one of my guests, who's an aspiring politician, and it was, just out on the roadway, we were mingling, and I've made friends with I feel like I'm friends with the people in the building because I've had a very successful run of production, which I'll talk about a bit more. And I'm a gringo, I'm an outsider, I'm someone who knows there's a power in that outsideness, so I don't get involved with things that I can't be useful in. So that it has been the site of intense drug traffic for a long time, it lends to what I'm doing artistically, which is I'm reducing a stereotype, that sort of invisible magic that I'm attracted to in immaterial form. But I'm not ever going to get close to the drugs as a moral device. On that night, this aspiring politician looked at me. He saw the reaction that I could evoke. It's not a very gay place, let me put it that way, but to have a wedding cake on a counter and to have people really, not celebrating with us because it was only so much cake, but really like people coming up and having cake and talking. He said, when I run for like local council person, I'm going to need you. And I took it as such a compliment because he saw that there's a loving relationship. And I do love this building. I can tell you more of why I've fallen in love for it and the people that live there. But I thought to myself, no way in hell am I going to help someone get elected in that way. It would be the same thing that I wouldn't do, but I appreciated his observation because I would use the same energy or power, if you will, to finish doing things there that weren't bound by the 5 years. And right now, I'm happy to say a little update on it. We're a group of about 6 people who have come together, and we would like to imagine that the building bears the name Conjunto Santos Dumont. And my project has been to reduce a preconceptual name, Tremi Tremi, which suggests a broad instability, I'll go more into the stereotype, but one of the ways that we are doing this is we're doing a sort of education about the namesake. Santos Dumont was the airplane inventor for Brazil. He was a gay man. He committed suicide when he realized his airplanes were used for warfaring by the Brazilian state. And a lot of people, ask who actually came first, the Wright brothers in the U.S. or Santos Dumont. We know that he commissioned one of Cartier's first watches, I believe, was a sort of aeronautical, whatever. And he's just an interesting character. Industrialization period in Sao Paulo gave the nomenclature to this modernism. So you had modernism and industrialization meeting in this moment. And then ever since, you've had a building that's been hugely neglected. And that's interesting with having the Niemeyer Edificio Copan right down the road, another curvy, metallic looking facade that's beautiful to the onlooker. But you also have that disparity that a kilometer away, you can have a subsidized masterpiece. And just a kilometer away, you can have something of similar merit in modernism, not become infamous rather than famous, if you will. We would like to imagine that next year, in the centennial of modernism, if that reference, I can't give you all the names, but there's a rather well-known group of five. They're called the Group of Five artists back in 1922. Who conducted the first week of modernism. And so now we have the first centennial of that week. It'll be a year of activities next year in Sao Paulo. And we hope that there will be a 20-story LED installation, permanent installation, on one of the lateral facades of the tallest of the buildings, depicting two of the Santos Dumont airplanes, and all of the three buildings are named after these airplanes. We hope on the other lateral facade that the building will acquire a LED marquee, and that will spell out its actual name, Conjunto Santos Dumont, also reflecting the airplane motif. And we're pretty sure if we pull that off, that it'll be very, very hard to call the building Tremi Tremi when we've done, and we're also kind of like, I would have never gone straight for the architectonic solution I was much more interested in the immaterial form. But you get to a point where you see, yeah, this is something that the whole city could see. Like you could see it from very prominent parts of the city. And so it was actually so much more interesting to me because it naturally divided its public. So what happens with people that live beneath the sign is it is a literal sort of enhancement of the space. It'll offer lighting above a courtyard that we also hope to do some landscaping in. Per the aesthetic of the buildings, we've done murals and other things. We always get a lot of input before we hold a cultural event or produce a mural or a concert, youth program, neighborhood museum we did once in one of the apartments. But what we like about it is that it can be seen from far away, and that I was never really interested in bringing a big crowd to the site because, and here I'm going to do a run through the projects just to establish what residency is or could be for each of them. For Free Dimensional, I had just lived in the Middle East and Sudan and Egypt for a while, and I'd made a decision early in my career that I would not pursue humanitarian assistance. So my frequency, my ability to work with and know these outside the art world organizations, it was where I started with sort of political science as my early toolkit. I met artists in those places. I was working in Khartoum in Sudan, and by day I was working for a big NGO as an advocacy officer, and by night I would investigate the cultural scene. And I realized very specifically that if an artist was in danger, and they were, that they would never know to enter this sort of NGO complex to find, I could find them in this way, but not in the way that they needed sort of a place to go to. And that was one of the births of Free Dimensional, the idea that someone needs to look out for this with a human rights lens and using some of the things that would be available to them if they saw themselves as human rights defender. We can't touch on everything, but I should enter that in 1998, there is a declaration for the human rights defender that exists within the UN, and it starts the provision of some rights and conditions offered to human rights defenders in danger. And what I've been trying to do for the last 20 years is make sure that artists in danger benefit from those benefits that exist under a slightly different nomenclature. So bringing the two worlds together, it's not just going into the two worlds, it's actually the project itself is to bring human rights or rights. I have lots of criticism of human rights, so it's more about a social justice. I'll go back to that as my most favorite word. So working and being on the board of Res Artis and working with the Alliance for Artist Communities, Trans-European Hall, all of the, I saw these as kind of snowball multipliers, because what I realized is you would just need a lot of people speaking in such of an echo chamber to have it catch on. Here's a moment where I get to say something that I've never really gotten to say, but when we first went to, I started off by going to a big human rights conference in Ireland, and my first ever Res Artis meeting in Berlin. And Rudolf Brunger is no longer with us, but he used to be the director of UFA Fabrik, and we were hosted, the whole conference was hosted there. He passed away a few years ago. He became a dear friend. But at that meeting, without being on the agenda, he really opened up space for me to share this fledgling idea. And then, of course, it went on to being on the board for about 4 years and being able to gently offer it. I was equally interested in the breadth of residency while offering that leadership and learning. Yet the residencies that I was able to partially manage or have influence on who they would take into their bedrooms were residencies that were becoming safety residencies. So that sort of sea change was interesting to me. It's also important that I fell out, I fell out of membership, if you will, with Res Artis by the time I started Lancionecci. And that's an important clarification, because I still really respect them, I should say. But I not only stopped being a board member, but I stopped really paying as much attention to it, because I was specifically doing something where a broad open call was not interesting. When we became a collective, Lancionecci. If Paula's watching, one of my colleagues said she might be watching. Hello. So I was more interested in the artists and the residential context that exist in daily life, and kind of redirecting that towards a problem of urban disparity, a right to the city problem, and eventually the specific problems that plague a specific building in the center of Sao Paulo. When the project started, I'd been invited into a residency myself, Casa das Caldeiras in Sao Paulo. I'd been given the space to come up with a big idea. This was in 2008. And truly, from that 6-month residency until the beginning in October 2012 was a process of gestation of this. I mean, and it's crazy because I didn't really go to Sao Paulo to have a Sao Paulo site-specific idea, but I guess people should be careful if they invite me on residency, because I seem to latch onto things. And I latched onto the ubiquitous lanchonete, or lunch counter, that not only are these practical places where you can buy your illegal Jogo de Bicho lottery tickets, your legal lottery tickets, your cigarettes, your phone cards, but they range from having food to just having coffee and alcohol, to being very culturally ascribed to, because in Brazilian culture, even if you're having an argument, vamos na lanchonete pegar uma cerveja, like there's a way that it is very cultural, and maybe only the top elites don't use these, but I think a lot of across class section of Brazil prize this often outdoor seating, this easy to stand up and have a beer situation. Brazilians love to stand in the street, and I love it, by the way. Sometimes we stand in the street and we just watch the cars trying to get around us. Maybe you guys do that in Italy too, but in New York, the police would have us cordoned. I find in Sao Paulo, we just kind of share the street in a different way. And the Lanchonete is a producer of those sort of street crowds.
Yeah, but it's a situation that is pretty unique. The one of Lancionecci when I was in Sao Paulo, I find it pretty. Even if we in Italy have a culture in all parts of Italy, it's something specific, and I want to highlight the importance as seeing Lancionecci from. Of course, you are.
You have to visit, by the way.
But what I find specifically important in your practice, and specifically about Lancionecci, is the ability you as a collective body, because it's not you as a starter. Now you are the ignition of it, but you did it with a group of artists. The ability of dealing and using the specificity of the social structure and use it to convey a meaning that is universal, no? And everyone seeing Cidade Queer and all the projects that stem from Lancionecci, I invite who is following us to take a look about the multi-layered activity and multi-year set of projects. What is specific and characterize all the different set of tools is that were, I would say, context sensitive. No, you are not Brazilian. You probably didn't live in Brazil before you decided to move there. But it's not a matter of living in the city, but it's a matter of having the sensitivity to understand the problems and provide a set of tools that can live beyond the end of the project. Given back to the idea of that all of your projects, apart from Lancionecci, are set in time, no? So you told us. And I think it's specifically important because this is something that is shared with the idea of residency, no? There is no residency, permanent residency. Probably the only thing or the very few things that all the residency have is the idea of a time limit, no? Idea of time limit allows the artist to focus, no, to his research rather than to the tool he wants to start. So this is specifically precious. And getting back to what you said before about architecture, no, and the project with the Dos Santos, of course. Every country has its own Dos Santos. I mean, people that are now whose stories, especially during modernism, are changed now to hide some aspect of their private life. We see with Wittgenstein, we see with Turing, we see with a lot of, apart from LGBT, but now in each and every case. But architecture is a language that is universal, no? So it's really interesting how you used it to give shape to your intervention, because I find it very insightful, and especially with dealing with the relics of modernism. So dealing with the relics of modernism, I can totally see why, of course, modernism does not imply only architecture, but probably architecture now gave us the most vivid image of modernism. So I find it so thoughtful from you to start from there.
Yeah. Go ahead. I
Please.
was just going to say, I had I had people that we would call naysayers, because I don't know, like I take such a long I take a long time to do everything, I realize, as I'm currently in an Arabic immersion program in Vermont. I hope that I'm learning Arabic. I'm a very slow learner, let's put it that way. But I'm also I think it has to do with why I set these multi-year timeframes, because the shrinkage across the projects from 10 to 5 to 2 is a confidence in methodology. They're also fit to the problem or the issue, I guess. I think I just forgot what I was. I'll go back to you for a second. The thought I was trying to build up to left me.
Yeah, I was another thing I would like to pinpoint from what you said are the concept of leadership and the concept of learning, because I think that we need to reconsider or to highlight the role of residencies as learning environments. So it's in a way of learning by doing, not in every case, but is about trying, to set, to experiment. So this idea of learning, I share, and I can totally see why you see the next step in your career to continue teaching. I think you are already a teacher, even if, and artists are researchers and artists are teachers in a way of a conformist way, non-standardized practice. They do not need a degree to teach us something about something that it goes beyond visual arts. And in terms of leadership, I've seen, because I met you during a public school, so I can totally see how you are able to allow everyone to be involved in what you are saying. But this is also problematic, I think, because not every artist has the relational skills that you have. So it's also important for artists like you that in their own practice build networks. You told me you consider yourself as also a designer of connections and relations, I don't know, or something like this, and I can totally see it. And I think your practice illuminates the one of those that do not have this set of skills, maybe are not so skillful in trying to connect and to keep it working. But you allow them to be part of this discourse. And it seems to me that it deals also with where an artist is based, because we know as Europeans, and as American, how being and from one nation to the other, it's important can change the fate. So I think your practice also deals with reshaping the art world to try to go beyond the Eurocentric and United States-centric modernist way of the art world. So
I hope so. Thank you. That's a big compliment.
No, it's the work of you and all the other artists, amazing artists. But I think you started to make this discourse essential in the right time, at the beginning of globalization. Now we are seeing, of course, the output of this long process. I have another question but you already answered, but I am going to ask it anyway, which is the thread that connects all of your projects, in my opinion, is the arts policy nexus. So the arts policy nexus allowed you to be part of the board of so many organizations, also political organizations. Do you see in the upcoming generation, in the generation that followed you, the same strategy in dealing with this, or you see a change? Do you think there is a change in intergenerational change in this approach?
It's interesting because I'm even hanging a little bit, Giulio, on the word policy, because in the end, I suppose I will be. I say this very reluctantly, but I suppose I'll be a doctor of sociology, I suppose. Whereas in the beginning, I started pursuing a much more vague field and a newer multidiscipline that's called policy. And it makes me think, I have an opinion about older and newer disciplines. For one, in an academic setting, I always identify as a researcher without the credentials. So you're right. Thank you. I think that a lot of us artists do amazing forms of research that go outside the box of academia. And we often need the credentials of academia to survive and past our midlife. But let me
change academia and to change academia from within.
I doubt that my doctor mother is on this call, but I work with a professor named Maggie O'Neill at the University College of Cork, and she's fond of saying to change the phallic university, and I'll go with that. I think it is a pretty phallic institution. Um, but some of the things you said, I'll try to wrap up a little bit. One, I think policy is a slippery word that can also mean many things. You have inter-organization policy, you have government policy. And I think what it bespeaks is big deal, like policy as law, policy as de jure law, policy as de facto practice. But whatever it is that's managing the system, whatever the culture of a system is, it's the ability for art to speak to change, social change, change in social justice terms. That's what I mean by it. I'm allergic often to more specific definitions of that. But anyways, just words. I love words. I've told I to whomever I pray, I've told them that I want a column in the future. So everyone should know my job goals are a multitude, but the one that I'm most interested in is having a weekly column, and nobody can give you that. So you have to just kind of build it and work for it. I'm slowly moving towards that because I'm really enjoying the word. I'm really enjoying texts right now. I've just finished a text that will be a chapter in Portuguese, a chapter in English, and also the curatorial text for Love Till It Hurts. I'm going to come right back into residency as a policy and residency as a connector. But let me say a little bit more about those of us who practice in immaterial form and those of us who are better or worse or starter or beginner with relational things. And I'm going to say relational things because I don't know that it's always relational aesthetics. In the chapter I've just written, I've argued that in some urgent contexts, it cannot be a consideration of aesthetics. It has to be seeing forms as doing other things before they become aestheticized. Thank you for saying I have relational skills. You know, as I write and as I actually get closer to a disciplinary pedigree, I think a lot about becoming an artist on one's own. So I am actually writing a book about the decision to become an artist, like why we decide to do this. Often before education, and then some people go to art school and some people go to other schools. I come from a working class farming background where the encouragement to go to school was strong, but the encouragement to go to art school was non-existent. And I think about how the ease for me of working in these relations has something to do with being somewhat outside of, or, I don't, I play with that now as I write, but certainly there's a kind of reality of when an artist is outside, not when the market says, look at this outsider artist and buy their work all of a sudden, but more of being outside of institutional networks. Like if you go to a school, you have its network, a very late understanding of the art market, where I wasn't really clued in on, if you make material form, you can actually take it to the bank easier than if you make immaterial form. So I'm happy that I came from all those things, and that it has, I don't know, that it's made me confident in working and having a methodology for immaterial form. Let me just go back in, Free Dimensional had this desire to recruit residencies of all stripes. Whereas Lanchonecci pulled back a little bit from the networks. It did not have membership. I mean, I had great relations. I could have always called Res Artistes, but I wasn't interested in the open when we had a residency opening, and we hosted about 50 artists and collectives over 5 years in Sao Paulo from around the world. I wasn't interested in those coming in an open call. I was much more performing the role of curator or artistic director, and had a very opinionated, like I wanted artists that I wanted to come in. I knew enough about the artists I was inviting to know that they could jointly catalyze with us the scene. And here's where I want to talk about being local. I also must use some of the names of my dear colleagues, Rafael Dibert, Paula Querido, Joel Borges, Tiago Gonçalves, Renato Simbolista. There are many, many people who, in Brazil, Brazilians, but not only, Abdullah, he's moved from Burkina Faso. He is a chef and he worked with us on many, many of these things. So there's so many people that came into the process. I got to host one of my favorite artists in the world. Akinboji Akinbi, the Nigerian photographer. we hosted from all genre, all media, and curators as well. And so that having an open call wouldn't have served us. We were enough people with opinions, and other people in the collective could suggest people. And I used, whatever production experience I had to try and, raise the funds. We worked closely with Goethe and other institutions in so doing. I've given a lot of thought, I wouldn't do any of the projects over again, by the way, because thankfully we get to enter these things with what I think is a very useful naivete. And I hope it was always a responsible naivete. I would never want to not be naive. I think it is one of my strengths. But I also take these long cycles. So earlier I started to talk about naysayers. I remember some of the naysayers when I was coming to do this, and I just know that they couldn't have known. These are local Brazilians, artists sometimes. They just couldn't have known the preparation cycle, like how much I put thought into it between 2008 and 2012. So I did not, I didn't hold it against them, as I thought, because I would keep hearing, how do you know this won't set off gentrification when it's trying to be a device working against gentrification? And a lot of times it would frustrate me because I'd be like, because I'd get it in, I went to this symposium in Den Haag called Wonder Symposium, and it was looking at extra special residency models. And I'm forgetting the guy from Rijksacademy, Jean, I'm forgetting his name, but a great old.
Jean-Baptiste Joly?
No, he's from Schloss Solitude, but this is Schroep, a guy who was at Rijksacademy for so long, a really dear person whose name is escaping me. And he quizzed me on it and kind of helped me with some of the language. He was in charge of their residency for a while. Schroefer, I'm thinking is his last name, but anyways, that'll come. And I would get annoyed by this because I thought, well, I'm on the activist side. I've studied this stuff a lot. And I think one of the things optically, because when we started, we did not have a place. We were calling ourselves Lanchonete conceptually and looking at the center of Sao Paulo, which was starting to go through this really fast beautification and gentrification cycle, leaving a lot of these rights totally out of the discourse. But also, let's be clear that the right to the city is a conceptual right. Lefebvre came up with the concept, and it was never actually something that the human rights establishment, there are first, second, and third generation human rights, and they are, political, civil, economic, social, cultural, and then group rights in the third generation. Not in any of these sort of formally defined generations of rights do you have the right to the city. I like it that way because some of those rights sets have atrophied. And what Lefebvre was doing, I believe, was creating a utopic device to talk about where we're living more and more, something that is yet to come, in a sense, that the city unfortunately brings people in for economic necessity, even when they might not want to be urban dwellers. So I think he was very future looking in that sense. And I encourage anyone to read his last very short essay. I think it's called Planetary Metamorphosis. Before he passed, he had rethought some of this and even considered how his own language of right to the city was being misused for the sort of capitalist project. And he encourages people to come up with new language to talk about these things. So he was never trying to get an established right to the city into human rights doctrine. And so what I know that I did, because I had studied so long the problem of gentrification in big cities. I lived in Cairo, I lived in New York. I was looking at this being a site-specific thing that spoke to other urbanisms. I thought how radical you would have to be. You would either not become site-specific and use an arbitrary name of lunch counter, which really endeared Brazilians to it when they understood that the gringo was really appreciating something pretty specific in culture. I love Brazilian culture. I've married into it at this point, so I'm there. But the notion that if there became a site, that it would need to be a site wholly controlled, and that by that I mean bought. That was not the fait accompli. We did not have to buy a lanchonete. But when that site availed itself, And it did. An urbanist said, "Hey, have you seen this lunch counter for sale in that building?" When I saw it, like, it was instant. I was like, this is it. Because it's such a small space, but with such a unique reputation in what is deemed such a problematic set of buildings, that I thought, and this was midway through the process, this was in 2016, I thought, boom, here's how we narrow down and actually affect the life of people with this discourse. And people, I mean, I had other artists in halls of art discourse just calling it an outright gentrification project. And it's interesting, and too, I'm going to say this here because I'm still confused. There's a project in Rio that's called Lanchonete Lanchonete. And no one ever told me, but I like to take it as a compliment as it became into being a little bit later. I kind of wish they'd given it a different name because it creates a lot of confusion now that we're an expired project and they use the name twice. So I don't know whether to be honored or insulted by this, but I'm going to take it as an honorable thing. Someone came up to me at the Venice Biennale, a Brazilian colleague from Rio, and he was like, "Todd, congratulations on Lanchonete, Lanchonete." And I couldn't speak because I was like, it's not a franchise. You know, I was like, it's not my project, but maybe it's an honorable thing. But I could see how some of the urban artists weren't coming in with as much of those outside relationships that gave notion to how you could manage such a thing. And you couldn't in this context without actually being almost a small business owner in that part of the city, so that your opinion mattered at a level beyond an art discourse, I believe. And that's my opinion. And I have a lot of respect for people who tackle Sao Paulo and art in that location.
Yeah. Thank you, because getting into the evolution of Lanchonete helps us to understand your point of view about this contradiction of art and the gentrification cycle. And of course, we all know, as a citizen of big cities, especially in the big cities, how this contradiction is far from being solved. And in so many levels, Lanchonete is an example of best practice, because it was built with the understanding of and the inclusion of what was around Lanchonete, and deepening the knowledge of Lanchonete as a social tool itself. I am interested also in the concept of naivete that you mentioned, because I think that naivete is pro-democracy force, of not being too specific at an early stage of the project, of allow ourselves as cultural operators, as curators, as artists, to have the time to adapt to the reality and to understand the reality. So this naivete, I think, should be more valued in the art world at large. And I find it interesting also the concept of disciplinary pedigree that you mentioned. So everything is so specialized that non-conformist education is a tool to also to bring democracy and social justice in the table. I see very insightful the idea of residency as a utopic device. I think in the 19th century, for instance, where artists started to travel and some of the models of residency started to be experimented. First, the idea of utopia was Monte Verità, those seasons. Maybe we need to get back to that season and high level, insightful level of utopia. And I would like to close with one last question, is about what is left. What is left of residencies? What is left of the residencies, of course, is the open studio. In so many cases, is an exhibition. In so many cases, an exhibition that is not an exhibition, that is often not meant to be an exhibition, that is a contradiction itself. But in your case, given your example of residencies, because you also was part of a resident before being a residency builder, an instrument builder. What is left? Because when I talked recently with Marinella Senatore, artist that created the School of Narrative Dance, Marinella is one of the leading, from my point of view, but luckily not only my point of view, one of the leading artists in this sense of building communities around her own practice. She told me that she was impressed, always impressed, by the life of the tools she created after the performance is gone, when the media is not talking about that community anymore, is not talking about Marinella, but the seed of what she did is still alive and is still working. And with heteronomia, no, she doesn't really know what is meant, what it will become. So I'm asking you, what is left? I mean, apart from this franchise, but is left a community, a sense of community?
You mean specific to Lanzonecci?
Oh, Lanzonecci, but not only Lanzonecci, because I think also some of your projects are not dealing with the local community, but with a topic, but it creates a community, even if it's not local.
This conversation is going to be so good for me in a couple other ways, because of course, to voice something in reaction to your question, maybe it's something that's already floating around my head that needed to be said. I'm going to use your question to talk about the latest project, Love Till It Hurts.
Thank you.
And then I'll also answer like what is left, because I guess if I have ever been an innovator in residency, what is left for me is going to be tested out on this last project. And as I said, the research of 2 years of really traveling the world and meeting artists who are working on HIV, both HIV positive I am, but also HIV negative artists who are working in allyship. I had the benefit, also you can shrink a project because practically fundraising becomes easier as an older artist, but I don't want to say that it's easy. I just want to say that I did not need as much time to find the first resources to start the third project, and I could then time it at a shorter cycle. I had the benefit of a grant that allowed me to travel around the world and meet people working with culture and HIV. And I'm thinking about what is left in general. If you see how I posted this talk on my Instagram, I use the words critical hosting. I believe that these things happen, and these things have, like, I like to think back to when artists were traveling and they would have just knocked on an artist's door first when they came to a new place, because that's where the conversation was going to go on all night. It wouldn't have been a banker, it would have been looking for others. And in that sense, I think it's going to be needed in every generation. And I think these late night smoking and drinking, not always great, but like these late night meetings are probably where some of the most important solutions we need come up. I esteem artists, and of course my personal frustration is when I want what I'm doing to be seen by the art world as art, and that's where you get a bit of a distance from me, where I'm like, well, that's a noise that I'm not as interested in. As I move more into writing and teaching, I think a lot about naivete. I think a little bit about Rancière and the sort of the ignorant schoolmaster kind of way of like, I don't know it all yet, but I think I'm ready to start being in a sort of recycle pattern where I'm meeting more with students in a pedagogical setting, having my ideas being shared a little bit easier by a book than mounting a 10-year project to share the ideas. Let me say this. I'm an artist and I want to stay safe. And I had a reaction, I believe, after 9/11. So Free Dimensional did something broadly for me, and I sort of doubt I'll ever need it in the sense of staying safe. Lanzonecci was probably more of the outsider, farmers, coming from a farm context, not having that art pedigree, and really looking at a context where in 5,000 people, you have so many artists who are living in that building, that to overplay the visiting artists from the actual artists living in the city, like you could create amazing catalyst by bringing together the right artists. And so my curatorial eye was always looking for who would help me catalyze this, and who would I have a great talk at night with, but during the day we would be producing something that couldn't help but advance the breaking of this stereotype. By the time I got to the third project, none of them, of course, are motivated by residency as a component. It was, of course, the most, so I live in cities, I love cities. So in Lancio Necci, there's also something for me, but something very broadly. It's about coexistence. It's about not having stereotypes about people's income and race and ability. And, how can everybody live in a city in a similar way, basically. As it got to Love Till It Hurts, it gets extremely personal. So it's a condition, HIV, that my own body holds. And I, of course, would not saddle the project with a residency component. Now, recently, and we've talked a bit, Giulio, about this, there's an exhibition, as you mentioned, exhibition. There's been a whole expography designed by one of the members of Love Till It Hurts, the Polish installation author, as he likes to be called, a dear friend, Jacob Szczesny, where we've been thinking about what sort of tool, knowing some of the conditions in the world, and this gets back to policy, by the way, knowing that there are places where it's illegal to be, like HIV is still criminalized, knowing that even if people sign on, like Egypt, to the WHO to give medications, that the moralistic provision of medications, also in Brazil right now, prevents people and kills people. We know that women, or anyone really who can be born with HIV, that vertical transmission is almost unknown of. We know that it runs along race lines, access to public health. All these things that kind of pertain to policy are the things that were confirmed to me when I was able to see different people's lived experiences. I have great luxury in my lived experience in being in Sao Paulo or New York, where healthcare is great, but you go outside of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and that's not always the case, especially under sort of dictatorial rule, which unfortunately it is leaning towards. The moralization of healthcare. Bolsonaro, in a trade-off with the evangelical church, he gave back to them control of health centers so that he would have voting bodies and blocks. So giving back control to a health center that would just try to deprogram a gay person if that's the way the way they're contracting HIV, the whole mentality around taking care, providing medicine is, it's in question right now in Brazil. And I want to point that out before the call ends, that people, just because Trump is out of office, please don't take your eyes off what is commonly called the tropical Trump.
We know in Italy too how it can turn into.
I know you do. But then just to get back to this, I came in not knowing, and I've moved around to the idea that if this exhibition, which we've given the title Exquisite Corpse, you can find out about it on lovetillithurts.co. If it should move around, we would need a partner, sort of a rhizomatic partner, perhaps a Goethe Institute. We would need specific partners in locations like Via Farini. We would need to go to places in the world where it's hard to talk about HIV. Again, a Goethe Institute, for example, or a British Institute in a place like Cairo, British Council, excuse me, you could actually achieve something politically with the security of those international bodies. And so Jacob has designed this expography in a way, and you just have to see it. It's online. If you look for Exquisite Corpse on Love Till It Hurts, you can see the drawings of it. It's something intimate, but it's also something that's protective, that encases a body of work or a video screen. This is an area I've rarely exhibited my own work because of its immaterial form. So me as a non-exhibiting artist coming up with an expography with a colleague is pretty hilarious, I think, but it's so beautiful. Like the expography is so beautiful. And so the next phase is really working to have a traveling, changing show activate so that artists and localities can get into a template. Not that I would curate the artists that go to a place. We would create the encasement of an idea so that it might catalyze a discussion locally, bringing some international artists to meet with the local artists.
Yeah, I find it inspiring and insightful also because the concept of the work itself, the exquisite corpse, the cadavere esquisito, is relational. No, it needs the relation with the viewer, and the relate and challenges you know to take a stance. So I'm glad you find this participatory format that tells so much about your own practice, your own voice as a visual artist, but also the need for the work to be completed. And there is also this playful of playing with images and with concepts that is so refreshing and non exhibiting in a way. You know, it doesn't need to be exhibited in a standard way. So it tells a lot about you and about how you see your work. So thank you for sharing this. As I know,
yeah, just add one thing before, because I suppose we might be. Are we closing down soon?
no.
Just whenever you need to, you can give me a signal. I've drank a lot of coffee this morning. I assure you, I'm jazzed. It's very important to say this in terms of methodology, that if not for some of the common, so I've always collaborated. I would say, if I were just to describe the 3-part series, that they are durational, multi-stakeholder, and rights-focused works. And everything that happens within the period, I don't take credit for it all. I know that it's all multi-stakeholder, but I try to, when I need to, I take credit for the envelope. And unfortunately, one needs to take credit sometimes to pay rent. But what I would like to say, one of the things that has been the most refreshing, the most rewarding, is seeing people from a previous project in collaboration in a new project, because each of the 3 new projects are thematically different. So you don't have the guarantee that someone would want to or be able to. But truly, I'm going to mention Jacob Szczesny again. Of course, you know that I met Paula Nishijima at the school at Via Farini, and that was in the Lanchonecci days. She is from Sao Paulo, so she knows the project and has visited it, but she was helpful living from Leiden in Holland on Love Till It Hurts, and now she's been helping a lot from Amsterdam. And so it's interesting how these crisscrosses happen. On Love Till It Hurts, a dear friend in Egypt, Adham Bakri, I was visiting him in 2019 before COVID stopped visits, and asking him for some design help. He's a wonderful artist, photographer, street artist, and activist. And he was helping me with just the design, the wrapping for the project. Whereas Jacob went on to help with the expography, Adham was helping with early design elements. And he came up with the exquisite corpse. He and a young Saif, a young colleague of his, we were talking about it, and they were like, why don't you use this? And their idea was based on safety. They were like, what if these little pieces, if you saw a sticker of one on the back of a computer when you walked into a cafe in Cairo, and you knew from your, like, you know, any sort of subcultural relations around HIV, you knew that what it meant, but it still kept you in a sort of safety. I've never known if it'll play out that way, but I loved the way they saw the old game Exquisite Corpse and its connectivity, and that we then went on, totally unbeknownst to me, to create this expography and this potentially traveling show, and then it getting that name. To me, it's so sweet. It involves like so many people who know my practice, and were probably also, they were probably also caring for me in a way, because I was doing the project that was the most personal to date. And I really have to send a thanks out to them, because I did the project for 2 years, because I probably wouldn't have been able to maintain beyond 2 years. Meeting other people, especially people in situations where they don't get medicine or are against odds, it makes for a pretty emotionally hot project. Let me just finish with one more line. I do believe that residency will take a role in Love Till It Hurts. I believe that this traveling, changing show will use a mode of residency to host the international artists within a community setting in the places the show goes. And I believe that that magic, that kind of coming together of local people concerned with HIV and public health, with the guests who are doing things in their own parts of the world. I believe whatever that takes, I think it'll take the form of something we did during Cidade Queer. If you want to have the specific reference, we worked with a collective called Explode Platform. And so within Cidade Queer's website, cidadequeer.lanchonete.org, you see the Explode Residency. That was the idea of João Simões and Claudio Bueno, two Brazilian artists, whereby for 10 days they opened a house in the periphery of Sao Paulo where Claudio had grown up and had sort of a live-in queer camp, like this queer discourse, HIV, and I was able to come in and out. I was planning the big ball that preceded it the next weekend, but I saw a lot of love. I saw a lot of care. I saw people in a house that had symbolism to the artist, breaking down and talking about things that don't get talked about in broader society. And so certainly one of my ideas about how a residential setting would accompany the Exquisite Corpse show is based after the Explode Residency, which everyone can have the link of. Wow, I've shared a lot. Thank you. Any more questions?
we did touch a lot of thank you, because we really touched a lot of topics thanks to your projects. Well, I think there is so much more to be said, but thank you. I want really to thank you. Of course, thank you also for showing us how all your projects that are different are really deeply connected by the relation you are able to create. Thank you very much.
I'm going to tell you the name of my book, even though it only has 3 chapters submitted, as one of the last things. Tell me when you're ready.
Yeah, right.
I'm writing a book right now that will serve as a sociology text, and I suppose it might qualify me for that pedigree. But the book and the book publishing offer predate that. The book is called Variations on World Making, An Artist's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a playful title. I'm certainly also referencing the block Adorno discussion of world making, and of course acknowledging that all the artists out there in this big world and in other galaxies make worlds, and it's heavy lifting sometimes, these worlds. So a shout out to other artists that do this.
Yeah, thank you. Also, residency is also about creating communities, ephemeral communities. So I'm looking forward to read this book, and thank you for sharing this.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
And thank you again, Todd, for your time. And thank you for your contribution to our research project. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And my last words, if it wasn't almost practical and incumbent on us to consider Exquisite Corpse for Milano, I would still want to come back to Via Farini, because I really enjoy it.
Yes, that will be great to have you here, to have you in Milan, and let's work on it, because it will be a wonderful further chapter, further residency. I'm looking forward to it. Yes.
Me too.
Okay.
Thank you again. So are we saying bye to everyone?
Thank you to everyone who's watching.
Thank you very much, Todd. Really was really interesting, illuminating, and the title of your book is really something special. I can't wait to read the book. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I just turned 48, and my goal itself is when I turn 50 that it'll be available. I've already got some chapters and I'm sharing them around. So, happy to have people encourage me along its completion.
Thank you. Thank you
again.
Thank you
very much. Thank you, Todd.
Bye for now.
Bye. Grazie a tutti. Bye.
Ciao. Ciao, belli.
Ciao.
Bellas.